Welcome to Mr. Kellin's Stories. I'm so glad you're here. This channel is all about bringing you emotional, heartwarming and inspiring tales that touch the heart and spark the imagination. Whether it's love, courage or overcoming challenges, you're in for an unforgettable journey. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new story. Thank you for joining me. Let's dive into these incredible adventures together. Mia Johnson stood outside the towering glass skyscraper of Caldwell Enterprises, gripping the strap of her purse tightly. The early morning sun reflected off the steel and glass, casting a golden glow over the city, but her nerves were ice cold. This was it, a new job, a fresh start, a chance to prove herself. As she stepped through the revolving doors, her heels clicked against the polished marble floors. The grandeur of the office lobby was overwhelming. Chandeliers hanging like crystal raindrops, sleek leather furniture, and the quiet hum of important conversations happening all around her. She felt small in the vastness of it all. Mia had worked hard for this opportunity, countless late nights studying, proving herself in every job she had ever taken, and now she was about to work for one of the most powerful businessmen in the country, Richard Caldwell. But as she walked toward the elevators, she could already feel the weight of eyes on her, the quiet glances, the barely concealed whispers. She was used to it. In high-powered corporate offices like these, black women were rare. It didn't matter how skilled she was, how much she had achieved. Some people would always see her as an outsider. She took a deep breath. "You belong here, Mia. Prove it." The executive floor was silent, except for the clicking of keyboards and the occasional ringing of phones. Every detail of the office screamed wealth, the thick carpeting, the modern art on the walls, the scent of fresh espresso in the air. Mia knocked on the heavy oak door of Richard Caldwell's office. "Come in." She stepped inside, her posture straight, her face calm despite the storm of nerves within her. Richard Caldwell sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, flipping through a file. He was an imposing man in his late 50s, his silver hair neatly combed, his sharp blue eyes assessing her before he even spoke. "You must be Miss Johnson," he said, his voice deep and unreadable. "Yes, sir." She kept her voice steady. "It's an honor to be here." He nodded but didn't smile. "I expect excellence, Miss Johnson. My schedule is tight, my expectations are high, and my patience is limited. You'll be handling confidential documents, arranging meetings with global investors, and ensuring that nothing falls through the cracks. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," she said again, meeting his gaze with quiet confidence. For a moment he simply studied her, as if searching for a flaw, a weakness. Then, with a curt nod, he handed her a thick folder. "Welcome to Caldwell Enterprises. Don't disappoint me." Mia took the folder, feeling both the weight of the papers and the silent challenge in his words. "This is just the beginning. I'll prove I belong." An unexpected encounter. Mia had only been in her new role for a week when she first met Daniel Caldwell. She had heard of him, of course. The only son of Richard Caldwell, heir to the family empire, recently returned from studying abroad. The media loved him, the golden boy with a brilliant mind, a charming smile, and a last name that made doors open effortlessly. But when she finally met him in person, she wasn't prepared. It happened on a late afternoon. Mia was in the hallway outside Richard's office, organizing documents on a tablet when she felt someone brush past her shoulder. "Sorry, She turned, and her words caught in her throat. Daniel Caldwell stood before her, tall and effortlessly handsome. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, his golden brown hair was slightly tousled, and his blue eyes, so much softer than his father's, held a flicker of surprise. He smiled. An easy, genuine smile. "I don't think we've met. I'm Daniel." Mia composed herself quickly. "Mia Johnson, your father's secretary." Daniel's gaze flickered with interest. "Ah, So you're the one keeping everything from falling apart around here? She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. I prefer efficiently managing operations. He chuckled, clearly amused. Noted. It's good to meet you, Mia. His voice was warm, his presence effortless, but Mia didn't let herself be distracted. He's your boss's son. Nothing more. But Daniel wasn't someone who faded into the background. Over the next few weeks, he seemed to appear everywhere, popping into his father's office while Mia was organizing documents, joining meetings where she was taking notes, passing her in the hallways with a casual, "Hey, Mia," as if they were old friends. At first, she told herself he was just friendly, but then there were the small moments, when he lingered a little too long in conversation, when his gaze held hers a beat longer than necessary. One evening, as Mia was leaving the office late, she found Daniel waiting by the elevator. "Working late again?" he asked. She sighed. "Your father's schedule is brutal," Daniel smirked. "Tell me about it. I grew up with him." The elevator doors opened and they stepped inside. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged. "You know," Daniel said suddenly, "I've worked in a lot of places. London, New York, Tokyo. I've met a lot of people, but I've never met someone who carries themselves like you do." Mia frowned. "Like I do? Like you have nothing to prove, even though the world keeps trying to make you prove something." His words struck something deep in her. For a moment, Mia didn't know how to respond. Then the elevator dinged and the doors slid open. "Good night, Daniel," she said softly, stepping out. He didn't call her back, but as the doors closed, she could feel his gaze still on her. And deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. The office of Caldwell Enterprises was always buzzing with movement, meetings, phone calls, deals being sealed behind closed doors. But in the midst of it all, Mia and Daniel kept finding each other. At first, their conversations were brief, casual exchanges in hallways and conference rooms. "Busy morning?" Daniel asked one day, as Mia rushed past him, a folder tucked under her arm. She barely glanced at him. "When is it not?" A smirk tugged at his lips. "You ever take a break?" She didn't stop walking. "I'll rest when your father learns how to schedule fewer meetings." Daniel chuckled, watching her disappear into his father's office. She was different from anyone he had ever met, sharp, determined, and completely unimpressed by his last name. And he liked that. Over the next few weeks, their interactions grew longer. What started as work-related discussions evolved into something deeper. One evening, Daniel found Mia still at her desk, long after most employees had left. "You know," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "this company can survive a night without you." Mia glanced up, exhaustion in her eyes, but a hint of amusement on her lips. "Can it, though?" He grinned. "Fair point." Instead of leaving, he stepped inside and sat across from her. "What's your story, Mia?" he asked, genuinely curious. "How did you end up here?" Mia hesitated. Most people didn't ask her that. They assumed she was just another employee, another face in the background. But Daniel's eyes held something different: interest, respect. She sighed, setting her pen down. "I grew up in a small town. Not much opportunity, but my mother always told me I could be more. I worked through college, took jobs that barely paid enough, but I knew if I kept going, I'd get here. And now I am." Daniel listened intently, nodding. "That's impressive." She shrugged. "It's survival." A pause. Then she tilted her head. "What about you? You've had everything handed to you, haven't you?" He laughed, but there was no arrogance in it. "Yeah, but that doesn't mean I didn't want more than what was expected of me." Mia studied him. Maybe they weren't so different after all. Soon, they stopped needing the office as an excuse to see each other. It started small, grabbing coffee together after work, then lingering a little longer over dinner. They talked about everything, life, childhood, dreams they were too scared to say out loud. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking the city skyline, Daniel turned to her. "I used to think I had everything figured out," he admitted. "But the more I talk to you, the more I realize how much I don't know." Mia smiled. "That's the first step, realizing you don't have all the answers." He chuckled. "You always have something wise to say." She nudged him playfully. "It's a gift." The laughter faded, but the warmth remained. As the city lights flickered around them, something shifted between them. It wasn't just friendship anymore. Daniel had been with women before, models, heiresses, women from his world, but none of them made him feel the way Mia did. She challenged him, made him think, made him want to be better. One night, after a long conversation over dinner, Daniel walked Mia to her car. As she reached for the door, she paused. "You're different from what I expected," she admitted. He raised an eyebrow. "And what did you expect?" She hesitated before saying, "Someone like your father." Daniel exhaled sharply. "I'm not him, Mia." She nodded. "I know." They stood in silence for a moment. Daniel could feel his heart pounding. He wanted to kiss her, but instead he stepped back. "Good night, Mia," he said softly. She smiled. "Good night, Daniel." As she drove away, he realized something terrifying and undeniable. He was falling in love with her. Daniel should have been happy. Love was supposed to feel good, wasn't it? But as soon as he admitted his feelings to himself, the fear crept in. His father. Richard Caldwell was a man of tradition, of control. And Daniel knew, without a doubt, that if his father found out about Mia, there would be consequences. He could already hear the words his father would say. "She's not one of us, Daniel. You have a duty to this family. This isn't love, it's a mistake." Daniel clenched his fists. No, this wasn't a mistake, but was he ready for the fight that would come? Mia, too, felt the weight of reality. Late at night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart conflicted. She liked Daniel, more than liked him, but she wasn't naive. He came from a world that wasn't built for her. His family, his wealth, the expectations placed upon him, it was all a barrier between them. She had worked too hard to build a life for herself. Could she risk it all for love? As she closed her eyes, one thought haunted her. Even if Daniel was willing to fight for her, was she willing to fight for him? The next morning, when Mia walked into the office and locked eyes with Daniel across the room, she knew one thing. This wasn't over. Their story was just beginning. The evening was supposed to be simple. A quiet dinner, just the two of them, away from the eyes of the office, away from the pressures of reality. Mia and Daniel had chosen a small, elegant restaurant on the outskirts of the city. Candlelight flickered between them, casting soft shadows on their faces as they laughed and talked. The weight of the world felt distant, at least for a little while. Daniel reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. "I wish every night could be like this," he murmured. Mia smiled, but there was hesitation in her eyes. "You know it can't." His jaw tightened. "Why not?" She sighed, pulling her hand back. "Because of your father, because of your world." Daniel leaned in, his blue eyes filled with determination. "Mia, I don't care what my father thinks. I care about you." And for a moment, Mia allowed herself to believe it. But they weren't alone. In a darkened corner of the restaurant, hidden behind a partially drawn curtain, Richard Caldwell watched them. His grip on his wineglass tightened, his knuckles white with suppressed rage. His son, his only heir, was sitting across from a woman who, in his mind, did not belong. His breathing was slow and controlled, but inside, a storm raged. He had built his empire on power, wealth, and tradition. He had planned every step of Daniel's future, ensuring that he would one day take over the Caldwell legacy. And now, that future was at risk, because of her. Without another word, Richard stood, placed a crisp bill on the table, and walked out. Tomorrow, he would put an end to this. The next morning, Daniel arrived at work as usual, unaware of the storm waiting for him. As soon as he stepped onto the executive floor, his father's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Daniel, my office now." Employees turned, their eyes wide with curiosity, but no one dared to say a word. Daniel's heart sank. He knows. Steeling himself, he strode into his father's office. The door slammed shut behind him. Richard stood behind his massive desk, his piercing blue eyes cold as ice. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Daniel didn't flinch. "I assume you're referring to Mia." Richard slammed his hand down on the desk. "I saw you with her, at the restaurant. Do you have any idea how this looks?" Daniel crossed his arms. "It looks like a man having dinner with a woman he cares about." Richard's face darkened. "No, Daniel, it looks like a disgrace. You are a Caldwell. You have a legacy to uphold, and you're throwing it away for... Daniel's voice turned sharp. "For what, Dad? Say it." Richard's nostrils flared. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "You know exactly what I mean." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "Do you hear yourself? It's 2025, Dad. And you're standing here furious because the woman I'm seeing has dark skin." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not just that. It's about status, about class. She's not one of us." Daniel let out a cold laugh. "Not one of us? You mean she didn't grow up in mansions? She didn't have private schools and unlimited opportunities handed to her?" Richard's jaw clenched. "She's a distraction. She doesn't belong in this world. And if you keep seeing her, you'll lose everything." Daniel stiffened. "What are you saying?" Richard straightened, his expression unreadable. "I'm saying that if you continue this relationship, you're done. No inheritance, no position in the company, no support." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. His entire life had been built within the walls of Caldwell Enterprises. He had trained for years to take over, to continue his family's legacy. But now, his father was asking him to choose wealth, power, security, or Mia. He exhaled slowly, his heart hammering. "You're seriously willing to cut me off, just because I love her?" Richard's expression hardened. "Yes." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Daniel nodded. "Then I guess I have my answer." He turned to leave. "Daniel!" his father called, his voice sharp. Daniel paused, his hand on the door handle. "This isn't just about you," Richard said, his voice low. "If you keep seeing her, I will make her life hell. I will make sure she never works in this industry again. I will destroy everything she has worked for. Do you understand me?" Daniel's blood ran cold. He turned slowly, his hands clenched into fists. "You wouldn't." Richard smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Try me." Daniel walked out of his father's office feeling like the walls were closing in. His mind raced. His father had always been ruthless in business. But this was a new level of cruelty. As he stepped into the hallway, he caught sight of Mia. She was standing by her desk, flipping through papers, unaware of the battle that had just taken place behind closed doors. If he stayed with her, his father would destroy everything she had worked for. But if he walked away, he would destroy himself. His chest tightened. What the hell was he going to do? The world around them was cold and unkind, but in the quiet spaces they carved for themselves, love burned bright. Daniel and Mia knew they were walking a dangerous path, but neither of them could turn back. Their love was whispered in the shadows, hidden in stolen moments, tucked away in places where judgmental eyes couldn't reach. But even in secrecy, the weight of reality pressed down on them. They became skilled at hiding. At the office, Mia remained nothing more than Richard Caldwell's efficient secretary. She kept her head down, never lingering too long when Daniel was near. Daniel, too, learned restraint. A glance across the room, the briefest brush of fingertips when passing in the hallway, small gestures that spoke of a love they weren't allowed to show. But when the sun set, when the city grew quiet, they found each other. A dimly lit cafe on the far end of town, where no one knew their names, became their sanctuary. A secluded park, where they could walk hand in hand beneath the shelter of the trees, became their escape. A small apartment, where the world outside disappeared the moment the door closed, became their home, if only for a few precious hours. They lived in the stolen spaces between expectations, and yet, no matter how hard they tried to stay hidden, fear followed them like a shadow. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of her apartment, Mia stared at Daniel, her heart heavy. "Daniel," she whispered, tracing patterns on his palm, "I don't want you to lose everything because of me." Daniel caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her fingertips. "I won't lose anything that matters." She shook her head. "Your father is serious. If he finds out, he'll take away your place in the company, your inheritance, your entire future." His expression hardened. "Then let him." Mia pulled away, searching his face for hesitation. There was none. "You say that now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But one day, when the dust settles, you might regret it." Daniel cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears she hadn't realized had fallen. "Mia, listen to me. Money, power, none of it means anything if I don't have you." She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But deep down, she knew love wasn't always enough. Their secret love was intoxicating, but secrets had a way of unraveling. At work, Mia started to feel the weight of suspicion. Colleagues whispered when she entered the room. Conversations stopped abruptly when she passed by. One afternoon, a fellow secretary, Lisa, leaned in with a smirk. "So, Mia, you and Daniel seem to have gotten pretty close lately." Mia forced a smile, keeping her voice steady. "He's my boss's son. Of course we work together." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Uh-huh, just work, right?" The words clung to Mia like a warning. People were starting to notice. And if Richard Caldwell found out, it would all come crashing down. One night, Daniel took Mia on a drive to the outskirts of the city. They parked beneath a sky full of stars, the night air crisp and cool. "Sometimes," Daniel murmured, staring up at the vastness above them, "I wish we could just disappear, start over somewhere new, just you and me." Mia rested her head on his shoulder. "Where would we go?" "Somewhere quiet, where no one cares about last names or skin color, where we can just be." Mia closed her eyes, letting herself imagine it. A small town by the ocean, a little house with a garden, waking up to Daniel's arms around her without fear, without shame. It was a beautiful dream. But that's all it was, a dream. Because the reality was that they were running out of time. And secrets never stayed hidden forever. Secrets don't stay hidden forever. No matter how carefully Mia and Daniel guarded their love, the walls of Caldwell Enterprises had ears. And those ears belonged to Victoria Hale. She had been Richard Caldwell's most trusted assistant for years, a woman who believed in loyalty, discipline, and above all, preserving the Caldwell name. She had seen it all. The desperate employees trying to climb their way up, the social climbers looking for a taste of wealth, and the women who thought they could charm their way into the Caldwell dynasty. And now she had seen Mia Johnson. Victoria first noticed the change in Daniel before she even suspected Mia. His smiles came too easily. His eyes searched the hallways as if looking for someone. He lingered in places he never used to, by Mia's desk, near the break room, at the office exit right around the time she left. But then came the real clues. The way Mia stiffened whenever Richard was in the room, the small, secretive smiles she and Daniel exchanged when they thought no one was watching, the electricity between them, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Victoria started watching more closely, and she didn't have to watch for long. One evening, as she left the office late, she saw them. Mia and Daniel standing close together in the parking lot, Daniel's hand brushing against Mia's cheek as he whispered something that made her smile. They thought they were alone. They weren't. Victoria pulled out her phone and took the first picture, then another, and another. By the time she walked away, her mission was clear. Richard Caldwell sat in his grand office, sipping a glass of bourbon as he skimmed through reports. His company was thriving, profits were soaring, his legacy was untouchable, or so he thought. Then came a sharp knock at the door. "Come in," he called, barely looking up. Victoria entered, her expression unreadable. "Sir," she said smoothly, placing a folder on his desk. "I believe you'll want to see this," Richard frowned, setting his glass down and flipping the folder open. The first image was enough to send a wave of pure fury crashing through him. By the third, his hands were shaking, his son, his heir, with that woman. Victoria's voice cut through the silence. "I thought you should know before this got out of hand." Richard closed the folder with a sharp snap, his face twisting in disgust. "Get her in here," he growled. Mia felt the shift in the office before she even knew what had happened, the glances, the whispers, the way people moved out of her way. Then Victoria appeared at her desk, smiling coldly. "Mr. Caldwell wants to see you. Now?" Mia swallowed the lump in her throat but nodded. She wouldn't let them see her afraid. She walked down the long corridor, each step heavy with an unshakable sense of dread. Victoria didn't speak as she led Mia into Richard Caldwell's office, closing the door behind her with a soft but final click. Mia had been in this office 100 times before, but today it felt different, colder. Richard sat behind his massive desk, his piercing blue eyes locked onto her like a predator sizing up its prey. "Sit," he ordered. Mia hesitated, then squared her shoulders and took a seat. For a long moment, silence. Then Richard leaned forward, his voice like ice. "I gave you a job," he said slowly. "I trusted you in my company, and this is how you repay me." Mia didn't flinch. "I've done nothing wrong, sir." Richard's lips curled in a sneer. "Nothing wrong?" He grabbed the folder and tossed it across the desk. The pictures spilled out, evidence of her crime, her and Daniel. Mia's stomach twisted, but she kept her face calm. Richard stood abruptly, slamming his hands on the desk. "You think I don't know? You think I'm blind? You and my son have been sneaking around like a pair of reckless, foolish children." Mia met his gaze. "Daniel and I love each other." The words felt heavy in the air, undeniable, irreversible. Richard scoffed. "Love? Don't be ridiculous." He walked around the desk, towering over her. "You're a smart woman, Mia. Surely you don't think this will last?" Mia held her ground. "Daniel and I aren't doing anything wrong." Richard leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You will resign immediately." Mia's breath caught. "If you refuse," Richard continued, "I will make sure you never work in this industry again. I will ruin your career, your reputation, and everything you've worked for." The room was suffocating. The weight of his power, his hatred, pressed down on her like a crushing force. But then, clarity. She saw him for what he was, a man ruled by fear, fear of change, fear of losing control, fear of a world that no longer bowed to men like him, and she refused to be afraid. Slowly, Mia stood, her back straight, her eyes locked onto his. "You can take my job," she said, voice steady. "You can try to ruin my career, but you can't take away the love your son and I share." Richard's face twisted with rage, but Mia didn't wait for another word. She turned, walking toward the door, each step filled with a defiance that couldn't be broken. Victoria smirked as she passed. "I warned you." Mia didn't acknowledge her. She had bigger battles to fight, and she wasn't going down without a war. As soon as she stepped out of the building, the cold air hit her like a slap. She felt everything and nothing all at once. Her career gone, her stability ripped away, but her dignity untouched. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, seeing Daniel's name flashing on the screen. For a moment she just stared at it. Then slowly she answered. "Hey." Daniel's voice was soft, careful. "Mia, what happened? Victoria just called me and I got fired," she said, exhaling a shaky breath. Silence. Then, "Where are you?" "Outside your father's building." "Stay there." His voice was firm, urgent. "I'm coming." She closed her eyes as she clutched the phone tighter. Because no matter how powerful Richard Caldwell was, no matter what he took from her, he couldn't take Daniel. And she would fight with everything she had to hold on to the love they built, even if the world tried to tear them apart. Everything shattered with one phone call. Daniel had just wrapped up a meeting when his phone buzzed. Seeing Mia's name on the screen, he answered with his usual warmth. But as soon as he heard her voice, everything inside him went cold. "I got fired." For a moment he couldn't breathe. "What? What happened?" "Your father. He called me into his office and he threatened me, Daniel. He said if I didn't resign, he'd ruin my career." Her voice was steady, but Daniel could hear the pain beneath it. His father did this. The man he had always admired, the man who had raised him to be strong, to be just, had crushed the woman he loved without a second thought. A slow, burning rage ignited inside him. "Where are you?" "Outside your father's building." "Stay there. I'm coming." Daniel stormed through the halls of Caldwell Enterprises like a hurricane, his heart pounding with fury. Employees turned to stare. He never walked like this. He was always calm, composed, the perfect air. But today there was fire in his veins. He didn't even knock when he reached his father's office. He slammed the door open, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Richard looked up, startled. "Daniel, how could you?" Daniel's voice was low, dangerous. Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I assume you're here about Mia." Daniel clenched his fists. "You assume right." Richard exhaled, like a father exhausted by his son's childish tantrum. "Sit down. Let's be rational about this." Daniel laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "Rational?" He took a step closer. "You fired the woman I love just because she doesn't fit into your perfect little world. That's not rational, Dad. That's cruel." Richard's expression hardened. "I did what was necessary." Daniel shook his head, his pulse hammering. "No, you did what was racist." The word hung in the air, thick and heavy. Richard's jaw tightened. "Watch your tone, son." "Or what?" Daniel challenged. "You'll cut me off? Take away my inheritance? Go ahead." He spread his arms wide. "You can control your company, but you don't control me." Richard's eyes flashed. "This isn't about control. It's about preserving our family's legacy." Daniel slammed his hands onto the desk. "What legacy?" His voice cracked. "One built on prejudice? On exclusion? On pushing away the best thing that's ever happened to me?" Richard's silence spoke louder than words. Daniel took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "If you can't accept Mia, then I want nothing to do with this business." His father's head snapped up. "What? You heard me?" Daniel's voice was steady now. "I quit." Richard looked like he had been punched in the gut. "You're being ridiculous." "No, Dad. I've been ridiculous my whole life. pretending that you were a good man when deep down you're just afraid of change. A flicker of something crossed Richard's face. Fear, pain, regret. Daniel didn't wait to find out. He turned, his pulse roaring in his ears, and walked out. This time he wasn't looking back. As soon as he stepped outside, he saw her. Mia. She stood on the sidewalk, her arms wrapped around herself, staring off into the distance like someone trying to hold herself together. The moment she saw him, she straightened. Daniel! He crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, and then, without a word, he pulled her into his arms. She melted into him, her body trembling against his. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "I'm done with him, done with all of it." Mia pulled back, eyes wide. "Daniel, you—" "I quit," he said simply. "None of it matters if I don't have you." Tears welled in her eyes. "But your future, my future is with you." He cupped her face, wiping away the tear that slipped down her cheek. "And I don't care what I have to do to prove it." Mia let out a shaky laugh, half disbelief, half relief. "You're really willing to give it all up?" He smiled softly. "It was never mine to begin with." She stared at him, her hands resting against his chest, feeling the steady, strong rhythm of his heartbeat. And then finally, she let herself believe it, let herself believe that love could be bigger than hate, stronger than fear, and unstoppable when 2 hearts refused to break. Inside his grand office, Richard Caldwell sat alone, the weight of his son's words crushing him like a mountain. For years he had believed in power, prestige, legacy. For years he had shaped his son into the perfect successor, and now, with a single decision, he had lost him. He stared at the family portrait on his desk, a photo of Daniel as a young boy, standing beside him, looking up to him with innocent admiration. Now that boy was gone, and Richard was left with nothing but his empire and his regrets. For the first time in his life, he wondered if he had been wrong. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he had won. Daniel had never felt more free. For the first time in his life, he was standing on his own. No father's money, no family name to fall back on. Just him, his choices, and the woman he loved. Yet freedom came with a cost. The night Daniel packed his bags, the weight of his decision hit him. His father hadn't called, hadn't tried to stop him. Maybe Richard thought Daniel would fail. Maybe he was waiting for his son to come crawling back. That would never happen. As Daniel zipped his suitcase, he took one last look around his penthouse, the sleek furniture, the grand city skyline, the life of luxury he was leaving behind. But when he turned, he saw Mia standing by the door, her eyes filled with both love and worry. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. Daniel stepped forward, cupping her face in his hands. "Mia, all of this, the money, the power, it was never mine. It was my father's dream, not mine. My dream is with you." Tears glistened in her eyes, but she nodded. And just like that, they walked away from it all. Mia's apartment was nothing like the luxury Daniel was used to, but it felt like home. The space was small, the furniture was worn, and the kitchen sink dripped constantly. But when Daniel collapsed onto the couch with Mia beside him, he exhaled a breath he didn't even know he was holding. This was real. No butlers, no expensive champagne, just them. The next morning, reality set in. Daniel had no job, no steady income, no backup plan. He had always been the heir to Caldwell Enterprises. His future had been set in stone since birth. Now he was a man with nothing but his skills, ambition, and a woman who believed in him. So he got to work. Daniel spent weeks applying for jobs, but every interview ended the same way. "You're overqualified. You don't have experience outside your father's company." Why would a Caldwell be interested in a position like this? Doors kept closing. Mia watched him struggle, her heart aching, She knew this wasn't easy for him. One night she found him sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. She walked up behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "We're in this together, okay? You'll figure it out." He turned, looking up at her with a tired smile. "How do you always know what to say?" She pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Because I know you, and I know you won't give up." And he didn't. Finally, a small consulting firm took a chance on him. The pay was nothing compared to what he once had, but Daniel felt more accomplished than ever before. For the first time in his life, he had earned something on his own. Life wasn't easy. There were days when the bills piled up, when Daniel came home exhausted, when the weight of their struggles felt unbearable. One evening, Daniel found Mia sitting at the table, staring at an unpaid electricity bill. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I hate seeing you worry about this." She looked up, giving him a tired smile. "Welcome to the real world, Mr. Caldwell." He let out a dry laugh. "I guess I had it easy before, huh?" She reached across the table, taking his hand. "You had it easy, but now you have something better. You have a life that's real, and we'll get through this." Daniel squeezed her hand. "As long as I have you, I can get through anything." One evening, after a long day at work, Daniel came home to find Mia cooking dinner. Something simple, something warm. She turned and smiled as he walked in, her eyes lighting up in that way that made every struggle worth it. "How was your day?" she asked. Daniel dropped his briefcase and wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing his face into her shoulder. "Tough," he admitted, "but I'm the happiest I've ever been." She turned in his arms, searching his face. "Really?" He nodded, brushing a curl from her face. "Because I get to come home to you." Her eyes softened, and she leaned up, pressing a kiss to his lips. In that moment, Daniel knew he had made the right choice. Not because life was easy, but because it was real. And for the first time, he was truly living. Richard Caldwell sat alone in his grand study, the dim light of the chandelier casting long shadows across the polished mahogany desk. The room, once a place of power and command, now felt suffocating. The empire he had built, his company, his wealth, his influence, felt strangely hollow without his son by his side. It had been months since Daniel walked out, months since the heated argument that had severed their bond, and yet every night Richard found himself staring at the door as if hoping his son would walk back through it. But Daniel never did. Richard was used to a structured life, business meetings, high-profile dinners, boardroom victories, yet without Daniel everything seemed off. The evenings were the worst. Dinner was served at the long, empty dining table where Daniel's seat remained untouched. The house, once filled with conversations, father and son discussing business, future plans, investments, was now eerily quiet. Every time Richard's phone buzzed, his heart leapt, hoping it was Daniel. But it never was. Had he truly lost his son forever? One evening, restless and unable to focus, Richard wandered into his private study. His fingers trailed over the leather-bound books on the shelf, but none of them interested him. His eyes drifted to his desk, where an old wooden box sat untouched, a box filled with memories. He hesitated before opening it. Inside, stacks of old photographs lay neatly arranged, memories of a life he had long buried. And then he found it. A faded photograph of a woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile, Daniel's mother. His breath caught. Charlotte, the love of his life, the woman he had fought so hard to marry, and suddenly it hit him like a tidal wave. Richard's family had never wanted him to marry Charlotte. She wasn't from a wealthy background. She wasn't the proper choice. His father had called her an outsider. His mother had warned that she'd never belong. But Richard had fought for her, because he had loved her, and now, decades later, he had become the very man he once despised. He had become his own father. The realization was a knife to his heart. How could he have been so blind? Richard sank into his chair, gripping the photograph tightly. He thought about Daniel, his only son, his pride, his legacy. A boy who had once admired him, looked up to him, wanted to be just like him. And now Daniel wanted nothing to do with him, not because of business, not because of power, but because Richard had chosen his prejudice over his own son's happiness. A lump formed in his throat. He had spent his whole life believing that legacy was built on money, power, and bloodlines. But what if legacy wasn't about what you left behind in the world, but who you held onto in your heart? For the first time in years, Richard felt something foreign creeping into his chest. Regret, the kind that clawed at your soul, the kind that whispered, "You've made a terrible mistake." He had pushed away his son. He had pushed away the woman his son loved. All for what? Pride? Reputation? A name that would mean nothing if he had no one to share it with? Richard closed his eyes, gripping the photograph. He could still hear Charlotte's voice in his mind. Love is the only thing worth fighting for, Richard. Don't ever forget that. His throat tightened. For so long he had convinced himself that he was protecting his family's future. But now he realized he had been destroying it. Slowly, carefully, he reached for his phone. It was time to make things right, even if it was already too late. Richard hesitated before dialing. Would Daniel even answer? Would Mia? Would they even want to hear from him after all the pain he had caused? He had built an empire, commanded thousands, shaped industries. But this single phone call terrified him more than anything, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. He took a deep breath, staring at the photograph one last time. And then he pressed the call button. It was a quiet evening. Mia and Daniel were curled up on the couch in their modest apartment, the soft glow of a lamp casting warm light over the room. The sound of rain, tapping gently on the windows, created a peaceful atmosphere. They had settled into a routine, a life built on love, effort, and shared moments of joy. Daniel rested his head on Mia's lap, and she absent-mindedly ran her fingers through his hair as they both watched the television, although neither was truly paying attention. It had been a long day, but there was a calmness between them, a quiet assurance that whatever came their way, they would face it together. And then there was a knock on the door. It wasn't the soft knock of a delivery person. It was urgent, almost desperate. Mia and Daniel exchanged a confused glance, both wondering who could be visiting them at this hour. Daniel stood first, his movements slow and unsure. He opened the door, and there, standing in the doorway, was a man they had both thought was lost to them forever, Richard Caldwell. Mia's heart skipped a beat. Richard Caldwell, the man who had once been her employer and the man who had made her life so difficult, was standing on their doorstep, looking completely out of place in his tailored suit. His usually confident and commanding posture was now replaced with something that resembled vulnerability. He wasn't the towering figure of authority Mia remembered. Instead, he looked smaller, his face lined with regret, his eyes heavy with something far more human than what she had seen before. "Mia! Daniel!" His voice broke through the tension, thick with an emotion she hadn't expected to hear from him. "I know this must be a shock, but may I come in?" For a moment, neither Daniel nor Mia spoke. The room felt like it was closing in around them, the weight of Richard's presence almost too much to bear. But something in his expression softened Mia's usual guardedness. She stepped aside, her eyes flicking to Daniel as if seeking reassurance. He nodded, though he looked just as uncertain as she felt. As Richard entered, the door clicked softly behind him, sealing off the world they had known and entering a new, unexpected chapter. Richard stood awkwardly in the center of the small living room, his hands tucked into his pockets. The weight of his words felt heavy, as though they were lodged deep in his chest, needing to be released. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Richard spoke. I don't know where to begin." He paused, his voice rough, almost as if he were fighting against the emotions threatening to overtake him. "I've been a fool. I was wrong. I let my prejudice blind me. I let my pride blind me. And I see now that what I did to both of you was unforgivable." Daniel's heart beat louder in his chest. He could feel the air in the room shift as Richard's words began to sink in. This wasn't the same man who had ordered him to stay away from Mia. This wasn't the same man who had been so certain about his own superiority. Richard took a shaky breath, his voice quieter now. "I didn't understand. I didn't see what love really meant. I was so fixated on status, on keeping up appearances, that I failed to see what was right in front of me." He looked directly at Mia, and for the first time she saw genuine regret in his eyes. "I was wrong to push you both away, to treat you like you weren't worthy. Of love, of happiness." Mia's chest tightened. Emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel suddenly overwhelming her. Richard's apology was not what Mia had imagined. When she had thought of him months ago, when the weight of his rejection had broken her heart, she had only seen him as the enemy, the man who had stood in the way of her love for Daniel. She had spent so much time loathing him, hating him for tearing them apart, for believing that race mattered more than love. But standing in front of her now, with tears glistening in his eyes, his voice cracking with remorse, Richard Caldwell seemed like a different person. Mia didn't know how to respond. How could she respond to this man, the man who had once dismissed her so completely, now standing before her, vulnerable and human? She glanced at Daniel, who had stepped closer to her, offering her silent support. His eyes met hers, his gaze filled with uncertainty. She could see the fear that had once been there, fear that his father would never change, that their love would never be accepted. But now there was something different in his eyes. Hope. "Mia," Richard's voice was softer now, "I don't expect you to forgive me just like that. But I want you to know that I've spent these months thinking about what I've done, thinking about how I treated you and how I treated Daniel." He looked at his son, eyes full of apology. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm sorry for everything, for the pain I caused you, for the hurt I caused both of you." Mia felt tears well up in her eyes. She couldn't stop them, couldn't stop the flood of emotions that had been building for so long. She had always known that Richard's pride would be his downfall, but she hadn't realized just how much his heart was breaking too. There was a long pause before Mia stepped forward, her heart heavy with the weight of Richard's words. "Richard," she started, her voice trembling. "It's not about forgiveness for me. It's about change. It's about growth. You've hurt us, but it's clear you're trying to make things right now." She swallowed hard, blinking back her tears. I want you to understand. Love, real love, is not about race. It's not about status. It's about acceptance, about seeing the person standing in front of you and accepting them fully." Richard nodded slowly, his eyes brimming with emotion. "I know," he whispered. "I see that now." Mia looked at Daniel, who stood beside her, holding her hand with quiet strength. Together they had built a life. Together they had fought against the odds. And now, with Richard standing before them, the door was finally open. Maybe not all the way, but enough to begin again. "I never wanted to come between you two," Richard said, his voice full of vulnerability. "But I did, and I'm truly sorry for that." Mia stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "We're not perfect, Richard, but maybe we can try again, one step at a time." For the first time in a long while, Richard allowed himself to hope. The road ahead would still have its challenges. There would still be obstacles to overcome. But as Richard looked at Mia and Daniel, his heart swelled with something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility of redemption. In that small apartment, with the rain falling softly outside, 3 people stood together. Family, in the truest sense of the word. And for Richard, that was enough. The day was finally here. After months of navigating the rocky road of change, Daniel and Mia stood side by side, ready to take the most important step of their lives together. The air was thick with excitement, and the gentle hum of anticipation filled the room as guests took their seats in the elegant ballroom, their eyes fixed on the altar. Mia stood in her wedding dress, an ivory gown that shimmered with elegance, a reflection of the woman she had become. Her heart raced in her chest, but she couldn't help but smile, knowing that this day wasn't just a celebration of her and Daniel's love, but a victory over everything that had once tried to keep them apart. Beside her, Daniel looked just as radiant, his suit perfectly tailored, his eyes alight with joy and love as he took Mia's hand in his. The road to this moment hadn't been easy. There had been heartache, loss, and difficult decisions, but here they were, together. And then Richard Caldwell, the man who had once tried to tear them apart, stood before them. He wasn't the cold, rigid figure of power that Mia had once known. Today, Richard was something different, something better. As the ceremony began, Richard's eyes remained on Mia and Daniel, his heart swelling with pride. Pride for his son, for the love they had found in one another, and for the woman standing beside him, Mia, who had changed everything. When it was time for Richard to give his speech, he cleared his throat, standing before the gathered crowd. The room fell silent in anticipation, the weight of his words felt deeply by everyone present. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, yet filled with emotion. "Today is not just a celebration of Daniel and Mia's love. Today is a moment for me to admit publicly how much I have wronged both of them." There was a collective breath held in the room. The tension in the air was palpable. "I was blind," Richard continued, his eyes never leaving Mia's face. "I was blind to the truth that love doesn't care about the color of one's skin. It doesn't care about status, about wealth, or about what society tells us is acceptable. I judged based on appearances, on preconceived notions, and in doing so, I nearly lost my son." The crowd shifted, some murmuring softly, others nodding in understanding. Richard's words were like a healing balm to the wounds of the past. He turned toward Daniel, his voice thick with emotion. "Daniel, I am so proud of you, proud of the man you've become, and proud of the love you've found. I am truly sorry for everything I did to stand in your way." Then Richard faced Mia, his gaze softening even more. "Mia, you have brought light into my son's life. You are not just a part of his world, but now you are a part of ours. I was wrong to ever doubt you. I welcome you into the Caldwell family with open arms." Tears welled in Mia's eyes as she listened to Richard's heartfelt apology. For the first time, she saw the man before her not as an obstacle, but as someone who had finally understood the importance of love. His acceptance felt like the final piece to their story. The vows had been exchanged, the promises of forever spoken aloud. Daniel and Mia stood hand in hand, eyes locked with each other, their hearts beating as one. The priest smiled warmly at them before turning to the guests. "By the power vested in me," he said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The room erupted in applause, but all Daniel could hear was the sound of his heart pounding in his chest as he leaned in to kiss Mia. The kiss was soft at first, a quiet promise, but as it deepened, the love they shared flowed into the room, filling every corner of the ballroom with warmth and hope. The crowd cheered, their claps echoing in the spacious hall, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. It was just Mia and Daniel, the love they had fought for, finally celebrated in full. Richard stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart full, watching his son and the woman he now knew would change his life forever. The weight of his earlier mistakes no longer bore down on him. In its place was the peaceful knowledge that he had witnessed something truly beautiful, a love that had overcome every barrier set in its way. As the applause began to settle, Richard stood and cleared his throat once more. He turned toward the guests, who were still basking in the warmth of the newlyweds' joy. His voice rang out, clear and full of conviction. "Love should never be judged by the color of one's skin," Richard said, his words carrying across the room. "It is the heart that matters. It's the heart that makes a person worthy of love." His gaze shifted to Daniel and Mia, standing together with hands tightly entwined. "I've learned that lesson the hard way, and I am so glad I did." The crowd applauded again, some wiping away tears, others simply moved by the sincerity of Richard's words. Mia looked up at Daniel, her heart full of gratitude. This wasn't just the beginning of their marriage, it was the beginning of a new family, one built on acceptance, growth, and the powerful force of love. As the reception carried on, the room was alive with laughter, music, and dancing. Mia and Daniel shared their first dance as a married couple, twirling and swaying to the melody of their song. They were surrounded by family and friends, both old and new, who had come to witness this moment of triumph. And through it all, Richard watched. He wasn't just watching a wedding, he was watching the future. He was watching love win. He had spent years building an empire, but in that moment, he realized that the true legacy of the Caldwell name wasn't the company or the fortune. It was the love they now had for each other. Mia and Daniel's love had changed him. It had opened his eyes to a truth he had denied for far too long. And now he could finally say with full certainty that love, in all its forms, was the most powerful force in the world. The night ended with a final joyous kiss from Daniel and Mia, the room filled with cheers and applause, and their hearts, stronger than ever, filled with hope for the future. Love had conquered all, and this was just the beginning.